Okay, guys, now, this uh channel here, um, Lavender Blue is my transgender channel, and it's more about the concept of just a video diary to myself, with my own life, a diary to myself, and just had something, the things that are on my mind, maybe I can help someone else, okay? Living up to the expectations of other people. Okay. When I transitioned, I didn't transition all at once. I transitioned kind of slowly, a little at a time. Because when I was in the 90s, mid 90s, you know, I didn't have hormones or anything in the mid 90s when I started transitioning. But I consider it to be a type of a transitioning because I was presenting myself as female and I was passing as a woman. So I mean, I wasn't, you know, on hormones or anything, but I did what I was able to do, which is pass as a woman in public and present myself as a female most of the time. To me, back in the 90s, my opinion was that I would rather be androgynous 190 or 100% of the time and be authentic with myself, living my way, rather than to put on a dress and be a weekend cross dresser. There's nothing wrong with being cross dresser. That's just not what I wanted to do. Dressing and all that stuff is fine and wonderful and many friends, but I didn't have that much desire. I want at that point in my time in 1996. In 1995, I started thinking about cross dressing and going out dressed as a woman. But in 1996, I changed my attitude. In 1996, I started thinking about. I had all these books that I'd checked out about transsexualism, you know, from the library that I worked at, which is a college library. And these books were old letter date books from Harry Benjamin, like the transsexual phenomenon. And I got in touch with someone that sent me a pamphlet through the mail about the sex change. And back then, the internet was in its infancy, back in 1995. The internet was in its infancy, and you couldn't just go on YouTube and see YouTube videos because none of this really existed. So I went to the library and I looked up these books, Harry Benjamin, the transsexual phenomenon, and these kind of books, and I was reading these books at home. I checked them out from the library, and I went to a counselor at school because when I went to college, you could get free counseling, and so this counselor directed me to a place not too far from here to where they did a sex change, and they had hormones and everything they did at the university, and so and inquired, and they sent me a pamphlet through the mail, a big, everything about the transsexualism, and I read and I learned about how transsexuals live a little bit from these outdated books from Harry Benjamin in 1995. And all I knew is that I wanted to be a girl in 1995. I turned 22 years old in 1996. I turned 21 years old in 1995. 21. And I turned 22 in 1996. And I really started passing as a woman when I tweezed my eyebrows and I had long hair, natural long hair, and I just wore my clothes. I wore jeans and t-shirts and these jogging pants. In the 90s, these jogging suits were popular. That was like almost like um, polyester rayon type of jogging suits that men and women both used to wear, and it was kind of an androgynous type of jogging suits people used to wear. And I had long hair, and I started wearing these androgynous jogging suits everywhere in the mid 90s, in 1996. And I started passing, I tweezed my eyebrows and shaved my arms, and people started calling me ma'am and she and stuff. And I didn't need hormones to be who I wanted to be. And I hadn't even changed my name legally, and I wasn't working at that time because I worked at the factory. And then after my temporary factory job was over, and I really kicked into full gear experimenting. And I would say to you, transgendered people, I would say don't let the system. In the hippie days in the 60s, they started talking about beating the man. You want to beat the man. You don't want to serve the man. You want to beat the man, the establishment. But, screw the establishment. And all this stuff, these rules about transgender, you have to go to a counselor. You have to be recommended for hormones. You have to go on hormones. You have to go through all this red tape so you can be who you wanted to be. And well, for a year I did this. I consider it a type of a transition because transition can be transitioning to third gender, gender nonconforming, or transgendering to gender non-binary. Transgender in the modern sense doesn't mean you have to be a transsexual. Gender binary transsexual, like the old school. You can be gender non-binary. As a transgender. And I used to not support this idea, but now I do. Gender non-binary, and so that can be your transition. And I guess I was non-binary. And there's something called a transgenderist. There's transgenderism, a transgender person that's strictly transgender, not transsexual. You can be a transgender who's not a transsexual. You don't have to take hormones. And you don't have to go to counselors and doctors and all that stuff if you don't want to. In the 60s and 50s, hello, whoever's watching. In the 50s and 60s, most of the time, cross dressing was against the law. And cross dressing was against the law. And back then, cross dressing was against the law, but, the people where became cross dressers became, say hello if you're in here, cross dressers and transsexuals began to, you know, defy the system and stand up to the police in your Gene Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco. It was lesser known version of Stonewall. Okay. Here's a version of a Compton's cafeteria. Okay. Compton's cafeteria. Here were some of the girls. Okay. These are some of and back in the 60s, they didn't have many terms for transgender people. So they called themselves queens back in the 60s. Street queens, drag queens, street queens. Here's who they were. And, they would dress as a woman as much as they were able to get by with at the time, which is what I did when I was young, living with my family in a small Appalachian town. So basically, putting the power in the hands of the people, not in the hands of some doctors or people that can tell you, no, you can't be a woman because you can't afford hormones. No, you can't be a woman because you can't do this and that. Putting this stuff back in the hands of the people. Power to the people. That's what it's about. It's power to the people. Power to the people. That's just like the hippie movement, Power to the people. Power to the people. And that's more important than anything else, is power to the people. You have to take it to the streets. You have to take it, the power to the people. You're transgender. You own your identity. You own your gender identity. Nobody can tell you can't be a woman. You have the right to dress any way you want to. And that's when they started fighting with the police and being arrested for cross-dressing, because the whole point of Stonewall, nobody has a right to tell me what I can wear. Nobody has the right to define my identity but me. I have the right to define my identity. They don't have the right to define my identity. I define my identity. That's what it means, is you have the power over your identity to identify your identity. And that's what this is really about. And I gave up on it after a year, my transition after a year. And so 11 years, fast forward 11 years later, 2008, at work, I started going out part-time as a cross-dresser with a wig, going to the gay club and stuff with my friends. And this is the first time I really started going out in public again as a woman. So I started being a cross-dresser in the beginning of 2009. I had already lost some of my hair. So beginning of 2009, I started wearing a wig to work. And I was still a man, and people called me he and him, but I was presenting myself as a female again in that way, and gradually become more like a female. And and the customers called me ma'am and she, the customers did. And so things were going well with the customers, but the management just told me I could not use the women's bathroom, refused to gender me correctly, and refused to let me be a woman in that sense because I didn't have surgery and I didn't have some letter from a doctor or from some, expert or some kind of and it took a whole lot and a long, long time on my job to get them to accept me and to gender me female. It took a lot of work and the hormones, and I had to go to a counselor and start taking and get recommended for hormones by a counselor. Then I started taking hormones, and I got a letter from my therapist, and I changed my name legally. And eventually, I got my driver's license changed to female, and that gave me a little more traction. But really, you don't have to go through all that crap just to be a woman. If you're going to say, I don't use the men's bathroom, I don't want to be called Steve, my name is Sheila, I'm trans, my identity is in the hands of me. I don't have to, I shouldn't, in a way, I shouldn't have gone through all the BS I went through at that job. I just told them to go fuck themselves. If you're in here watching, say hello, don't be shy. I'm a transgender woman and I'm just talking to other transgender people. That's what it's all about, is your identity is in the hands of you. Your identity is in your hands. You can't let some boss or some legal entity tell you what your identity is. Hey there, Jackie Blue. Good to see you. So that's what you can take away from this stream, is the number one thing is that as a transgender person, in our modern world with the transsexuals, we go through all these red tape. But, for self-esteem and good self-esteem, you don't need to live up to the expectations of other people. We need to be ourselves, and that's a mental note to me. No, don't live up to expectations of other people. Just live your identity, your truth, and live your kind of wonderful. But basically, like I said, Jackie Blue, in 1995, I started looking up information, and the internet was in its infancy in 1995. So I got books from the library. Oh, yes, Jackie Blue, please listen. I'm glad you want to listen. That's a good thing. But in 1995, I started looking up all these books, getting these books from the library, and I got a bunch of library books because the internet was in its infancy. You couldn't just go out and watch YouTube videos about transgenderism like you can today. And so I didn't even have a computer back then. Then in 1996, I started presenting as female, passing as a female. I wasn't really working after October 96. And that's when I really started, passing more as a female. Even though I wasn't on hormones, I enjoyed being my true self in 1996, 1997. Oh, good. Yeah, that was a long time ago. And so after a year, I went back to living as a man, and fast forward to 2008. In 2009, I started presenting as female again, but it took a lot to convince people. Mom, okay, and so yeah, nothing. I was just wondering. I was going to tell you I'm going to go to bed. I said I'm going to bed in a minute. I said that's what I wanted to let you know. And so yeah. So I would just say that's why people fought against the police in the 60s and wanted to fight against the police in the 60s and have Stonewall riots was so people could fight for their right. In the 60s, they called them street queens, drag queens, street queens, Marsha P. Johnson. It would just be, you can be a drag queen and live as a drag queen full time. You can have your identity. Back in the 60s, they didn't really know about transsexual as much as they do. Huh? I'm going to, yeah. Huh, yeah. Okay, anyway, they was fighting with the police, and you can identify as trans, but, the term drag queen is just a general term for a man who dresses as a woman or a transsexual female impersonator, and there's nothing wrong with these terms, and getting mad for people calling you a drag queen. I don't care if people call me a drag queen. So in the 60s, people who dressed as women on the streets that tried to would wear makeup with men's clothing. They would have to wear men's clothing legally with the law, but if they wore makeup with men's clothing, they did what they could to look as much like a female as they could get by with, but to fight against the police and to stand up for their rights, it's like I have the right to dress the way I want to and have my identity. Nobody can own my identity. I own my identity. No, but I'm also looking back to the 60s and the struggle they had and why Stonewall, and to look up, Stonewall and the cross-dressing laws against a lot of cross-dressing. People were fighting for the right to be who they wanted to be. And there's a book, an old book called um, A City of Night by John Ritchie, um, and it was written in 1963, and about how cross-dressers and transgender people lived back in the 50s and 60s when cross-dressing was illegal and what they did, and stuff like that. And in 1966, they had the Compton's cafeteria riots, San Francisco, and that's why the Tenderloin in San Francisco is an official transgender historical district now because of the Stonewall Compton's cafeteria in 1966. And there was one called Cooper's Donuts riots in maybe 1959. But there were uprisings against the police and the anti-cross-dressing laws. And people back then, they called us drag queens, street queens, whatever, queens. The queens are out on the streets. So a drag queen is a preoperative transsexual. You're someone who's a cross-dresser, a transsexual that didn't want to get hormones, like a she-male or whatever. There's nothing wrong with these words. There's nothing wrong with cross-dresser. There's nothing wrong with she-male. There's nothing wrong with drag queen. So we don't need to get hung up on terms. We don't need to get hung up on words like that. We need to just accept that we have the right to be free and express ourselves for how we want to, and we don't need someone to tell us, you need to take hormones. You got to have a letter from your doctor. You got to have a letter that gives you the right to be transgender. No, you don't need no letter. You don't need hormones. If you want to take hormones, take them, but you don't need to do all that BS to be who you are. Own your identity, be who you are. Jackie Blue, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to get off here. Like, share, and subscribe. Um, and yeah, they're straight drag queens, heterosexual drag queens, but most of those straight people, I think people call them cross dressers, but the ones who do drag are more like gay people in a gay bar. But I'm gonna remember, live your best life now. Live your best life. And so I will see you another time.